Welcome everybody, and well done for finding the room. Um, I got lost on the way here. We're going to run through the presentations. We're going to keep it quite simple, 15 minutes each for all the presenters. When Murray arrives, the discussants will have 3 minutes, according to Murray. If the, just so you know, as the audience, the presenters have to stay fixed here. So if they look like, stand-up comedians or something, it's because they kind of have to because of the streaming. So we're going to run through the presentations, but I think the logic of the sessions is very clear, and look forward to a great discussion. Over to you, François.
Okay, good morning. My name's François STEENKAMP. I'm the co-author right at the back there, last one. It's alphabetical, so depending on how this goes will determine how much contribution I made. The topic is really quite a simple descriptive paper. We're just looking at the evolving task content of employment in South Africa. If you read any of the work by David Orta and all those guys that do that kind of work, that's kind of where this fits. I'll just give you a brief introduction, what we set out to do, the motivation for this work, just a story about the methodology and the data, how we bring this all together, and then just two simple areas of analysis: trends in task content of employment in South Africa, just big picture story, and then some sectoral, looking at sectoral variation in the story. So that's very, very simple paper, which is a good thing, I suppose. Okay, so the story about this notion of robots are coming to take your jobs, it's not a new idea. If you can basically program a machine to complete a task, that task and how that can basically take the place of a job. If you can program the task, then there's an opportunity for a machine to do that job. So that's not necessarily new. What is new is the cost of automation has fallen dramatically, and the speed at which it has changed is quite dramatic. And so that's kind of where a lot of this sort of work, this sort of auto paper, that's the one that we will kind of read when we get into this kind of work. These technological changes, they're going to impact on the labor market in an uneven fashion because different jobs require different skills. Technology influences those, reshapes the skills that are needed for the work, and that's sort of going to filter through. Now, there's two broad approaches to understanding the potential impacts of technological change on your labor market. The first is your skills-biased technological change. And here the idea is that your technology increases the demand for high-skilled workers at a rate far greater than the increase in the supply of those workers, and that impacts on the returns to those high-skilled workers. And there's a literature on this. The shortcoming, or not necessarily the shortcoming, but what it only really explains what's happening at the top of your wage distribution. So enter this sort of the routinization hypothesis, and that's sort of the paper that many of us would have read. And here the idea is that you've got your computer-based technological change that's got to displace workers in the middle of your income distribution and create jobs at the top and the bottom. And what happens is, concurrently with this technological change, the demand for workers that have routine jobs, or the task content of their jobs is routine in nature, so those tasks follow explicit rules that can be accomplished by machines, they're substitutable by the technology, that's concentrated in the middle of your wage distribution. At the same time, there's going to be an increase in the demand for workers in jobs whose jobs are characterized by non-routine tasks. And here those tasks are not sufficiently well understood to be programmed in computer code, and they are more complementary to the technology. And those are concentrated at the bottom and the end. So that's this whole sort of polarization story, whether it's wage polarization or employment polarization. Just to note, this paper doesn't look at wages. We just look at employment. Okay. And there's sort of empirical evidence sort of speaking to this, primarily in the developed country case. So what we do, just in the spirit of this, is we say, okay, well, let's look at South Africa's labor market and look at the task contents of employment and examine it over time. Okay. And so by investigating the labor market's evolving task content, we can assess whether, tentatively, whether there's been an increased utilization of automation and or other 4IR technologies. And then the second sort of component, the paper's evolved a bit, but the second basic component here is just looking at sort of cross-sectoral variation. Okay. So why do we do this? These studies typically focus on the developed country context, the US, the European Union, those sort of, the UK, those markets. There's a lot of work on that. There is a growing body of literature on developing economies, but that evidence is relatively mixed. So there's a bit of evidence of job deroutinization. So this paper by Hardy in Central and Eastern European economies, Maloney and Molina, they find evidence of deroutinization for 2 out of 21. So it's not so clear in their case. So the evidence is mixed. So we're contributing to that in a sense. In terms of South Africa, there's limited research at just simply detailing the story. So that's really what we're trying to do. What has been done, there's some work that are more specific, sector focused, such as manufacturing, and then studies where South Africa is one of the 21 developing countries, for instance. And so it's a more aggregate picture. So we're trying to look at a bit more specific. And then there's some recent work, a uni-wider paper, Davies and van Seventer. They find mild evidence of employment polarization. They don't adopt the task content lens. They really just what they do is they look at employment across occupation categories. So there's sort of, this is where we kind of go to try and work. Okay, so just in terms of the data and methodology, they're kind of intertwined. What we want to do is bring task content and employment information together. So the task content information, is sort of this occupation information network. So everyone knows ONET, or a lot of people know of ONET, and that's developed in the US. It's sort of a survey of employers and employees within those organizations, and they ask a lot of questions about a lot of different topics. The ones of interest are work activities, which is an aggregate of tasks. So there's 18,000 tasks in that data set, but yes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Okay. Okay, and then, so we use work context and abilities, and that's sort of put into approximately 1,000 standardized occupation categories in the taxonomy used by ONET, which is your standard occupation of classifications. The labor market data is that from PALMS, which one of the authors of that data is here, David Lamb, Andrew Carr, and Martin Witzenberg. So that is basically harmonizing labor force survey data from the OHS, October Household Survey, Labor Force Survey, Quarterly Labor Force Survey, bringing that all together in one harmonized data set. We focus on the period 2000 to 2019, and there the occupation is recorded using SASCO, which is the South African standard classification of occupations, which is derived from the ISCO, which is the International Standard Classification of Occupations. So when you do this sort of work, you learn about all these different taxonomies. And the way you bring these two together, the task content and the labor market data, is following these crosswalks developed by the Institute of Structural Research. So it's research partners in Poland, and then ONET. And then what you get is this sort of labor market data set where we've basically attached or merged in this task content data for each occupation. And there, so it's aggregated to about 365 4-digit occupations. And the sample that we focus on is working age wage earners in the formal private sector. So we don't look at self-employed, we don't look at the informal sector. Okay. In terms of constructing the routine and non-routine task content indicators, we follow the literature, we follow Asimoglu and Orta, and we use work activity and work context data. So those two modules from the ONET data. And we bring it together to form these task content categories. So routine cognitive. So that's a combination of these questions. So the C there stands for work context. So a routine cognitive occupation, you'll look at the importance of repeating the same tasks, the importance of being exact or accurate, structured versus cognitive work. If you're routine manual, the pace is determined by the speed of equipment, so think of manufacturing, controlling machines and processes, spending time making repetitive motions. Okay? A non-routine cognitive analytical, analyzing data and information, thinking creatively, interpreting information for others, and then non-routine cognitive interpersonal, establishing and maintaining personal relationships, guiding, coaching, guiding, directing, motivating, subordinates, coaching, developing others. So these are just some of the categories within the work context and the work activities data sets that are used to construct these sort of indices. So those are the ones that we focus on. It's quantitative information, and I'm not going to go through the equations how you generate it, but you basically end up with an index ranging from 0 to 1. And what we do is we classify each occupation according to one of these. It's either going to be one of these categories, and it's determined by which ranks highest. So just here as an example, these are your non-routine cognitive analytical. Here's the top 10 with the ISCO data. So economists come up tops, which that's purposely why I included that. Physicists, astronomers, chemical engineers, statisticians, computer programmers. So they, as you can see, they've got measures for the other categories as well, but they get put into this category here in the data. Okay. If we look at routine manual occupations, lifting truck operators, industrial robot operators, metal drawers, extruders, miners, quarry workers, chemical, there's really sort of mining and manufacturing occupations. And here's the other categories. If you think of non-routine interpersonal, you're looking at managers, chiefs, heads of villages, senior government officials. If you look at routine cognitive, bookkeepers, data entry operators, tellers, astrologers, cashiers, telephone coding. So there's a few that come up and you think you got to get your head around that. But those are examples of the type of occupations that fall within these categories. So they're mutually exclusive of the way that we set it up. And what we look is the share of employment that falls within each of these categories. Just quickly here, this is just a composite of those four. So the routine cognitive, the routine manual, the non-routine analytical, the non-routine interpersonal. And so it's just a index ranging from 0 to 1. So if you 0, your job is fairly non-routine or completely non-routine, and 1 is fully routine, and you're somewhere along that distribution as you go from 0 to 1. So you'll see in some of the graphs that follow, I move between the two measures. Okay. So what do we have here? We have the absolute employment levels by task content components. So the top there is routine manual, then it's routine cognitive. So it's the number of employed in the South African labor market fitting within each of these categories. This is routine, non-routine interpersonal, that's non-routine analytical. Okay, so the routine are red, the non-routine are black lines, and we see that they're all increasing over time. We see that the major form of employment is routine manual jobs, followed by routine cognitive. There's some sort of degree of where the gap is closed between those, and that means that your routine cognitive's grown a bit faster than your routine manual. And we find this evidence of sort of a pattern of relative deroutinization. So while all four categories, employment has grown over time, in this panel over here where we just sort of show the growth rate, we see that your non-routine jobs, employment in your non-routine jobs have grown a lot faster. Okay, so that's the sort of pattern, what we call in relative deroutinization. Similar, if we look at shares, so now we just look at the shares of employment in these categories. So the previous was just absolute levels in employment. If we just look at the shares, again, you see your routine, your employment is primarily going to be found in your routine employment or occupations, again, and then your non-routine are a lot smaller. But if you look at your routine manual, which is the largest component, that's decreased from 48.3% in 2000 to 39.7% in 2019. So that the share there has declined. The shares in the others have actually risen over time. And again, we get this sort of pattern of relative deroutinization where the growth in the non-routine occupation categories, this is growth in the shares, that's exceeded that in your routine occupations. Okay. This says the similar thing. This is just a growth incidence curve where we plot the number of share of employment with, employment growth within each of these quantiles as you move along. And so what it's just saying is that employment growth, so remember an RTI score closer to 0 is more non-routine, an RTI closer to 1 is more routine, and so your employment growth has been much higher in your non-routine occupations. This is the full period. The top is the 2000s, and that's the 2010s. So again, we see this sort of relative deroutinization. That's really the main story that we kind of pulling out here. In terms of sectoral trends, just quickly, your RTI scores vary. Your primary sector jobs tend to be more routine in nature relative to secondary sector jobs, which are still relatively high. The tertiary sector jobs are less routine, but there's a degree of heterogeneity. So financial jobs have much lower RTI scores or less routine relative to, say, wholesale and retail trade jobs. And that sort of comes through here. So this is primary sector, and again, we're looking at employment levels, secondary sector, tertiary, and again, you see your the black lines are growing faster than the red lines. So again, that's relative deroutinizations occurring across sectors. And if we look at the same sort of story by industries, it's agriculture is a bit funny. I won't talk about that now. But mining and quarrying, you see your non-routine occupations are growing faster. Manufacturing, they're growing faster. Utilities, construction, trade, storage, and communication, and then your community, social, and personal services. And those industries constitute about 2/3 of employment. So they really drive in this sort of relative deroutinization. So that's really the story. It's pretty simple. I'm not going to bother with the conclusion. We've got to move on. But I think it's really one-liner in terms of the key outcome. Okay.
Anda was very clever in making me a speaker and a chair. Where's Anda? I saw her earlier. So I'm incentivized to make sure everybody finishes on time, but nobody's timing me. So that's what she. I think it was Imran Valodia, if he's here, he said, don't bother coming to my session because I say the same thing all the time. But that assumes that you've all attended the same presentation I've done, which isn't the case. So what you're going to hear, some of you have heard, but hopefully you will see an evolution of our thinking on the informal sector. I don't know if I could have the presentation up. So in essence, the paper, as it's coming up, the paper is collaborative work with Harvard, the CID team, so Ricardo Hausman's team, the Treasury folks will know, sort of have done work in South Africa. The starting point for the paper, and in fact, a lot of the thinking here, is the idea that South Africa has these inordinately high unemployment rates, but yet this seems like an outlier that every single international observer, Hausman included, says, why isn't there a revolution on the streets? This makes no sense. So that's something that we just weren't able to, at least I think, empirically resolve. And that's essentially the seed for the paper, which is still being written. So this is sort of a 80% draft version of what the paper will hopefully look like. So it's a mixture of, let's call it empirically intensive work, like the co-authored work that we've done with François in the previous presentation, but then a slight detour to hopefully start getting us to think with all these clever people in the room about how can we think through policy challenges facing the informal sector. So that's really the sort of two part of the paper. I've tried to be deliberately provocative by calling it supply side economics of a good type, and you'll see where I'm going, and the notion that we should be looking more at firms, but in particular the informal sector. So what's the conundrum, right? The conundrum is the picture you've all seen that is almost, you know, it's sort of first year economics. Let's move on, right? We've seen this distribution and so on. But it's the second one that we don't often couple. And again, you've heard me say this many times, right? But it's the second one that is the spark for thinking about informality. And I want to propose that the reason we have such inordinately high unemployment rates for the sample, so this is a sample of middle-income countries, emerging markets, it's barely legible, but trust me, they're all emerging markets. The reason we sit at the right end of that distribution is because of this. So if you take the same sample and you look at the share of workers that are in the informal sector or self-employed, we're right at the bottom end of the distribution. So I could detour on all sorts of things for those who are visiting Cape Town or South Africa for the first time. Why does it look like a European city? Why don't you see the informal? So there are all sorts of attributes about our economy that make this visibly an obvious point, actually, right? So that's the first spark, which is, so we've got these, so maybe the reason we have high levels of unemployment are to do with the fact that we actually an outlier in terms of the informal sector. And this is, if I had enough time to prep this properly, I would have popped this up. This thing at the bottom, I would have popped it up afterwards, right? And so what I do in audiences, I say, okay, the average middle income country has the ratio of wage employed to the informal sector to unemployment of 45, 45, 10. For every 100 workers, there are 45 in wage employment, 45 in the informal sector, and 10 in unemployment. And then I say, write that ratio down for South Africa, right? And nobody ever guesses that first figure is actually 50. So we don't have a problem of wage employment, right? It's the second and the third. So the ratio for South Africa is 50, 16, and 34. So in fact, perhaps we're looking in the wrong place in terms of closing our labor markets, right? I'm not saying formal sector employment is not important. Don't worry about wage employment. Don't worry about investment, fixing infrastructure and Transnet and kickstarting mining revenue. I'm looking at Vuyo, right? All that stuff's really important. But if you're thinking of closing the labor market in a way that most other countries do it almost just as a natural consequence of economic growth and development or historical dependency, it's got something to do with the 16 and 34. It's got something to do with informality. And so the argument I would propose is that the way in which most developing countries, at least on average in the emerging market, close their labor markets is by allowing for a much larger informal sector. So that's the natural way in which you have low unemployment rates. You have basically a free market operating in the informal sector. And I want to propose, and that will be the second part, that we actually don't have that in South Africa. We've got a suppressed informal sector that's, again, part of policy dependency and path choices we've made. But just to be sure, the Harvard guys were like, no, we don't quite believe that your instincts, so let's do a little bit more careful modeling. So we sat down, you run a cross-country regression, and you ask the question, what do our output employment elasticities look like, right? Because maybe we're not growing at a rate that's labor absorbing enough relative to other emerging markets, and the answer is that's not true, right? So if you take output employment elasticities 1990 to 2020, the red dots for the audience, and I'm sure those online can see it, the red dots represents the South African elasticity, but in essence, for the full period from 2000 at least onwards, we're pretty much in the ballpark in terms of having similar output employment elasticity. So there's nothing to do with our growth or our structure or pattern of growth in terms of it not being labor intensive enough, right? There's a structural transformation argument. So maybe given patterns of structural transformation and the oddities of apartheid and the vestiges of apartheid, maybe we're on a path of structural transformation that suggests that we should have these low levels of informality. Well, in terms of wage employment, we bang on the regression line, but not in terms of informality, right? So if you look at informality across logs of income, GDP per capita, if you want to think of it that way, across countries, we're below the regression line. So for a given level of stage of development or GDP per capita, we have an informal sector that's too small. We also, for given levels of unemployment, right, or informality, have way too high an informal sector, an unemployment rate relative to our informal economy. So just to sort of, this is not new, right, in the sense that people have spoken in the literature, Kingdon and Knight, for those of you who remember, spoken about, well, we've got this incredibly small informal sector, but the literature didn't push it any further, right? They just leave it there, and then we go on and we talk about other things like education or supply side challenges for the unemployed and so on. So hopefully what we're trying to do is push us back into that agenda and say, well, are we thinking more clearly about the informal sector? Kishan Shah, who's part of the Harvard team, he goes further, and they've got a separate paper. He says, okay, well, let's look at the reasons for South Africa's high unemployment. So we go the other way. Instead of looking at output employment, maybe there's stuff there that explain high unemployment and it's nothing to do with the informal sector. And they find that the usual suspects are not a good enough reason. So minimum wages, bargaining councils, trade unions, all of that sort of, let's call it sort of first order neoclassical reasons are not significant enough to explain these very, very high unemployment rates. So this one I really, really like, right? Because let's run a cross-country regression and say for the given level of income, what is the predicted rate of unemployment we should have, right? Because that then gets us, well, here's the figure. I'm running out of time, so I won't go through it. But for 2019, the implied unemployment rate for South Africa, given our level of income, right, on this cross-country regression, should be 7% and not 26%. So that's that sort of brings the sort of stage of development story to a close, in my view. Okay, so we take this because that's a really cool paper, but increasingly I'm getting diff in diff out. I mean, like there's so many difference studies, and like, okay, we know the stuff's going to have a positive impact. So right, so what are we going to do about it? So maybe I'm getting old. So we went in and we started speaking to City of Cape Town officials, SALGA officials. We had a whole team of DPRU people moaning at me because they couldn't get hold of public officials. And so we come up with a model that excludes endogenous constraints. We're not interested in skills and financial constraints and so on. We're just looking at exogenous constraints to informal sector workers. The Constitution allows you to operate and trade freely. So any arrests, right? Any arrest, by the way, of foreign workers in the city of Joburg is unconstitutional, right? Really critical. The key piece of legislation governing the informal sector is this guy called the Business Act, right? I didn't know this, but we made a fundamental error. This act here, right, had no regulation about movements and storage facilities and license. None of that existed, but the municipalities, right, sort of just before democracy were getting very, very scared that they wouldn't be able to cope with all these people, right? There's a wonderful phrase in the informal sector amongst all of us, the chattering classes, these people, right, these workers. And so they put up an amendment. And the amendment is the cause of massive exogenous constraints to the operation of the informal sector. What do the amendments include? Things like trading permits and licenses, written notices of why licenses are denied and repealed. You can provide those. You don't have to specify the cost of the license, but you do have to provide for a license. So in other words, you can't operate if you don't have a license. And I'll go through some of these a little bit later. There's also, within the municipalities now have jurisdiction because of the Amendment Act to set these bylaws, things such as where you can trade and can't trade, right? So you'll notice you can't trade in parks, national monuments, near government buildings, large public events, right? So we had the wonderful World Cup. Everybody comes from all over the world in 2010, and we tell the informal sector you can't trade, right? That's a clear exogenous constraint. So these municipal bylaws become really critical as an instrument to regulate and, I would argue, constrain the operation of the informal sector. It's a critical barrier to entry. There are a couple of things that are important, right? All major metropoles have treat any kind of transgression, whether it's you selling where you shouldn't be or you don't have a license, as a criminal violation, right? So you can go to prison for this, for trying to sell goods and services in the most unequal society in the world, right? Just think about that. Because as the Harvard guy said as well, you try that in Mexico City, right? It's just, there's no way any city official is going to try and regulate the operation of the informal sector. The other thing we found in this regulatory sort of morass that constrains the operation of the informal sector is that you've got the National Road and Traffic Act. Has anybody ever thought about that? I've never thought of that, right? It turns out that that's really important because vendors can't go where they're restricting traffic, right? God forbid that our sort of big traffic stops are actually have people trying to sell us stuff, right? The National Buildings and Regulations Act, really important. So if you go into the city of Cape Town, there are no informal sector operators near buildings because they have laws which prevent the informal sector selling next to large retailers, right? The argument we make in the paper is that if you look at informal sector regulation, it leans more towards urban management. So it's an extension of urban management, and we're not experts, and I'm sure they saw Edgar Peterson and so on. The urban studies people are really good at this sort of stuff, but it's clear that we have an architecture we've inherited from apartheid that we've now imposed that looks less and less like business regulation and more like urban management. And I would ask the question, what does this legislation look like for Sao Paulo, right? Look at David and ask him, what does it look like for an average Latin American country? And I would guess that it doesn't even exist, right? These are the zones in the city of Cape Town who actually were at least responsive to us for where you can actually operate, right? So you have designated zones that allow you to operate in specific areas. So that's the spatial dimension, right? I've been told I have 2 minutes. But look at this. I want you to read through. Just imagine you're an informal sector operator, right? So we actually had one of our juniors try and register, and David is still trying to register, right? But here's the thing. If you're an informal sector operator, you have to register online. I mean, just think about that. You have to register online, which means you have to have bandwidth. It means you have to have a smartphone, right, or access to the internet, right? Immediate barrier to entry, e-services site of the city of Cape Town. You need things like an ID, a proof of address, a photo of yourself, right? All expensive, right? All expensive. The next step, you need to find a suitable trading bay that's being advertised, right? Then you are scored. If you receive the highest score through an automated system, you're asked to attend a screening interview, right? Following the screening interview, right, if you're successful, you have to pay for the trading permit, right? But that's not enough. Once you get the trading permit, you have to undergo an induction, right, on how to sell goods and services. This is the most ridiculous series of barriers to entry that we've put in place for the informal sector. The other exogenous, so those are all the regulatory constraints. So once you get through that, you're still faced with massive spatial constraints. And I'm going to have to run through this very quickly. We know the story. So So cost to market is very, very expensive in South Africa. I don't need to tell this audience, right? So massive spatial constraints. It turns out that urban infrastructure, some previous econometric work we did shows that amenities, so that's the bold in italics, amenities for small business operators actually improves performance, whether it's profitability, whether it's revenue, and so on. Amenities means infrastructure. Infrastructure is not ports, it's not roads. It's just storage facilities for your goods. The city doesn't provide that, right? So infrastructure for the informal sector, if I put it very simply, where do I get a table to sell my millies on? Where do I get, if this sounds ridiculous, it's how you close a labor market, right? And we don't provide that as a city, and the city is not incentivized to provide that. It's not regulated to provide that. And you'll find that in most cases, that for traders turns out to be a really important set of infrastructure points for them to be able to trade. Think of this as storage facilities, water, public toilets, electricity. I made the almost facetious point, but I think it's true, that it's easier to get storage facilities for a hot dog stand in New York City, right, than it is in the city of Cape Town. So, I mean, just think of that. Crime is a massive deterrent. That's a specific South Africa event. The World Bank study, is Javier here? They've got a great crime study, and I picked out this data point from their work, which shows that it's not only is the incidence of crime for small businesses really high, but it is previous work by Paul Chikella and others show that it's a massive constraint to a business actually starting up. We find in the old study, it's more correlation rather than causation, that if you purchase theft insurance as an informal trader or a micro business, it actually improves outcomes, which is how most businesses do it, right? You have to purchase insurance, right? But that market, so that's a product market structure, point is not even open to the informal sector. I don't have time to talk about my matrix, but essentially, I think we need to think of supply-side economics of a good type, which is targeted at firms. Yes, we think a lot about the top end, so large firms, so infrastructure is ports and roads and rail, which is really important for miners, but is irrelevant for the informal sector. But for the informal sector, you better be thinking about storage facilities and so on. There's a lot of work, and so my challenge to our communities, I don't think we've thought enough about firms. I think we think about RCTs, but we always focus on households, or too much on households. And the RCT world is fairly busy in terms of firms, or at least the self-employed economic activity, and I list the Bandiera study and Chris Blattman's work. And so, because I've completely run out of time, the final point I make is there not a point of departure for running an RCT for targeted at the informal sector? What are you trying to test? Well, I think you can run an RCT which treats the informal sector. I mean, you can think of variants of this, but infrastructure, crime prevention, right? License fees, zero rating that, transports, right? Subsidy, that's a difficult one, and then deregulation. But your control group, you just deregulate, for example, and see if that alone would do what you need. But in essence, for me, I think we've inherited, I guess the way to think about this, we've inherited a structure of the economy at that micro end that is completely impervious to market access to for the informal sector. And it principally falls on those 5 key areas of what I call these exogenous constraints. I would argue that if you think about removing some of those, at least test these, you're probably likely to see significant positive impacts in terms of informal sector growth. Okay, thanks very much.
Could I have the presentation? Hello, everyone. As they set up my presentation, I'm Jacqueline MOSOMI from SALDRU at UCT. I'm happy that François and Professor BHORAT went before me. they talked a lot about the challenges in South Africa. So this, I almost want to apologize that the title of the presentation is not, smart or cute, but it's a simple profiling, just trying to, profile which jobs are currently green in the South African labor market. It's not a projection study. It's basically trying to look at the tasks that, okay, I think I'm short, okay. The tasks that workers in South Africa do in their various occupations, and which of those can be classified as green. So the motivation really is, so going by François' presentation, we know that from technological changes over time and the changes of tasks that people actually perform in their places of work, there have been changes in the labor market in terms of where the jobs are going and in terms of what exactly you do has changed over time. So the expectation is that with the green transition, we expect that the tasks that employees perform are going to change. And so therefore, the distribution of current occupations is going to change, and the task content is also going to change. So we know that this is going to have implications on people's livelihoods, and especially knowing that South Africa is facing all these challenges of inequality, poverty, and high unemployment. So we kind of want to paint maybe a hopeful picture of what a green transition may bring to the labor market. So, but what is a green job? That's a harder question to answer. There's really no agreed upon definition, but what people seem to converge to is that they are jobs that are concerned with protecting the ecosystem, decarbonizing the economy, minimizing waste pollution, and just handling waste generally. So there are two major ways in which people try to measure or count green jobs. So it can either be a bottom-down approach where you look at entire industries and you look at industries that are concerned with these major issues of decarbonization, energy efficiency, or you can do the top-down approach where you try the bottom-up approach where you actually look at the workers and you ask yourself, what type of task do you actually carry out, and is it related to decarbonization, waste pollution, and sustainability, essentially? So this bottom-up approach is what people call the occupational tasks approach. And for you to actually carry out this exercise, you need tasks information. So what labor market surveys usually collect is they don't, in South Africa especially, we don't collect tasks information. So François was using ONET tasks dataset, which is an American industry level dataset, which collects all this information about tasks. But then you have to ask yourself a question about how the American economy then maps to the South African economy, and what kinds of synergies exist. So it becomes very hard to directly transfer such kinds of data set to the local situation. It can be done, but then you run into a few challenges in terms of especially crosswalking between the ONET and the South African Labour Force Service. So most of the literature that exists on trying to profile green jobs is, of course, from EU and America, because they have these types of data sets. So in this study, what we tried to do, we borrowed a methodology where you actually look at the description of occupations, and then you kind of run a text mining exercise where you basically ask yourself, from the occupational description, which tasks are people performing that look like, they are in line with the greening transition. So jobs, so if you carry out a task that is directly related to, waste, pollution, energy efficiency, then we are going to pick up that occupation as having some share of greenness in that job, in that occupation. So what we basically do, I'm going to try and hurry up. So this is what tasks, a green words dictionary looks like. So what basically the people we borrowed this method did is that they scrapped the net with words that are related to the green transition, also scrapped the environmental economics literature to get this, so you can call them root terms. So any word that is related to the green economy, biodiversity, and then, so you then link this to the description of occupations in ISCO. So ISCO has occupational descriptions, which we look at as the task statement. So for example, if you chose, if you looked at physicists and astronomers, so if a task is, for example, task B is conducting experiments, tests, and analysis, blah, blah, blah. So if you looked at the dictionary of green terms, so this particular occupation has no term that is related in any way to the greening of the economy. So then that particular task will be classified as a non-green task. But then when you look at meteorologists, for example, a task description is, for example, studying data collection from meteorological stations and forecasting weather conditions. So that is related to the green economy. So then that task would be classified as a green task. So how we calculate the share of greenness of an occupation is we count all the occupational tasks in that occupation. So if your occupation, you carry out 10 tasks, and 3 of those tasks are classified as green according to our definition, then your occupation will be classified as 30% green. So what this does is that it avoids the overcounting of the share of green employment in taking a whole entire industry and classifying that whole industry as green. So describing our results, so if you looked at this figure, so we classified green tasks into green strict. So green strict is if that task is directly linked to the greening of the economy, and green potential would be the entire bar, which combines the green strict and green broad. So green broad is expanding the definition of a green task to include jobs that may not be directly green now, but with the green transition, with the change in technology, this job might be strictly green in the future. So those are the green broad jobs. And when you combine green strict and green broad, then you get the share of green potential jobs. So what this figure shows is that green jobs are concentrated in highly skilled occupations, so the green strict jobs. So these are, if you understand the ISCO codes, so these are your major code 1, 2, and 3. So you will see these green jobs are concentrated under corporate managers, under engineers, mathematicians, and physicists. But then when you broaden up the definition of what a green task is, then you get a much larger share of other occupations that show up as having a green potential, meaning that we have an opportunity. If we focused on upskilling or improving conditions in these types of occupation, then we may incorporate many more workers and expand green employment moving into the future. So this is just a repeat of what the graph was showing. What this table wants to show is that whereas strictly green jobs are concentrated in highly skilled occupations, what we find is that when there are few low and elementary occupations that have a high share of green tasks that also employ a lot of people. So we know some of the challenges in the South African labor market, given the history, is that we have a very low-skilled, heavy bottom, and then a very thin top of the occupational distribution. So what we want to do is ensure that we improve the conditions in these occupations that have the capacity to employ many more people. So in terms of who are in these green occupations, so going from the previous table, we know that what I said is that these green strict jobs are concentrated in highly skilled occupations, and they are especially concentrated in blue-collar jobs and in jobs where women are underrepresented. So what that means is that the share of women in these strictly green jobs or even green potential jobs is much smaller. Trying to see how the share of green jobs has evolved over time, we find that the share of green strict jobs has not changed over time, but that could be an issue related to how we actually define the green tasks, because the definition from ISCO is static. It changes very slowly. But when you look at the green potential occupation, so this is when you broaden up the definition of green tasks, we see that increase that happened between 2013 and 2014. It could be a data effect. We know this very well from the labor force surveys, but it also coincides with the REIP4 policies that happened in 2011. So there was a lot of jobs created in the blue collar, solar panel installation and such kinds of jobs. So in terms of education, so this just relates to the tables I showed before, that graduates and people with just post-grade 12 education are over-concentrated in the green jobs. But still, as I said, given the labor market, you're still going to find a heavy, low-skilled occupations in these jobs. So because I have ran out of time, I think what the regression results show is basically the story I have been telling, that women are less likely to be in these green jobs, and so the youth are also less likely to be in these green jobs, and of course the people with low education. So what needs to happen are policies to ensure that we actually present these jobs as an option for youth employment, and we have to focus on, which has been said over and over again, skilling and including women in STEM programs, and also making sure that we improve the working conditions of these low-skilled, low-paid jobs that actually employ the majority of the South African population. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Presha RAMSARUP, and I'm not from UCT. Sorry. I'm from Wits University. I'm from a postgraduate research center at Wits called the Center for Researching Education and Labor. It is a research center that focuses on education labor market relationships. So my presentation is focused on some work that we're doing at the center. Obviously, we do a lot of work related to skills development, and it's actually going to be reflecting on some of the research that we did. If you want to move on. So where are we now? An important point is that what we're seeing in terms of this just transition is that the education and training system response is ad hoc, extremely reactive, it's fragmented, and it's highly inefficient, okay? And there's a lot of evidence that that we've got from different studies that can actually show us this. At the moment, the training and education responses is at least 10 years behind everything else that's actually happening. The second point, I have one of these things. Sorry, the second point then is that as we discuss skills in the just transition, we need to, there's a lot of emphasis on short-term thinking. And there's a lot of pressure being put. And this, comes from someone who's been working with colleagues trying to write the skills chapter in the JET-IP. And with a lot of pressure from people to look in the short term. And we need to be able to think about the short term, but with a much longer term. But in this paper, what I'm actually drawing on two studies, and I'm not going to present these studies now. One is done with the ILO. It's ongoing. It's looking at the energy transition in different SADC countries from the ILO's SADC energy program. And then the other one is with SANEA, which is the South African Energy Association, and looking at South African, the energy skills roadmap. The first argument that the paper makes is that skills is not an individualized activity. It is not about training individuals, okay? And that approach to skills is in essence short-term, okay? And it won't help us to build a skill formation system. So it makes an argument for thinking conceptually about the skill formation system. The figure is maps. And the paper tries to map out South Africa's skill formation system. So it argues that skill formation is a process. It's a set of moving parts, okay? And we need to think with these parts that shape and constrain each other. And just thinking about training an individual without thinking about how it's going to be assessed, where it's going to move. So that's why the fragmented approach that we're seeing, okay, which is leading to an escalating number of qualifications being developed with no pathways. And there are many people in these rooms that we've had conversations with no pathways, with no understanding, or, which we've seen in both these evidence in both the studies, if a qualification is developed and people are trained, the occupation will exist. Okay, it sets up that type of thinking. So the first line of argument that the paper has is to start to think about skill formation, not just skilling and training of individuals. It's a short-term response that is not going to help us to transform our skill system. Okay, and as you can see in the South African skill system, the South African skill system is a complex. And it is complex, and it's a complex issue. So we have education and training institutions, regulatory institutions, and of course where employment happens. And you need to be able to see the dynamics and the relationships between those things. And that's the skill formation, okay? And that's an understanding, or that's how we need to start to build. So in the paper, we make the argument that skill formation is a complex set of moving parts. And if we don't, and we continue to see skills as an individualized activity, we're going to end up with fragmented, sporadic, and a skills response to the just transition that has no longevity. Okay? And I think that drawing across, and then what I tried to do in this paper is looking across the two studies that I flagged. I tried to pull one kind of thread in this paper. And I'm arguing that one of the things that's setting us off in the way we're operating at the moment is the use of the supply and demand metaphor. It's a problematic one. And it doesn't help us to think about skills development as a process. It doesn't help us to think about the different dynamics. What it does is that it sets up an idea that skills are needed in the economy, and the education produces the skills, and the job of the education sector. So what it does, it sets up a style of thinking that puts skills outside the economy itself. If you're following me. So the paper argues that supply and demand, drawing on Alain's argument, is actually the wrong lens to understand skills formation, because what it does is that it helps you to focus on particular things and you miss the big picture. Okay. And in the paper, what I do is I draw four kind of streams. Is that really understanding the greening of occupations needs quite nuanced ideas around how the occupation is being greened. It needs information around, is the field of knowledge changing? Are the materials that the occupation's working on changing? Is the kind of goods and services being produced changing? Are the tools and machineries being used? So it needs quite a detailed assessment of the actual tasks of the occupation. And going into these studies, all of those studies went into with the understanding supply and demand purpose. Their purposes was, it actually misses it. It misses the types of nuance around the occupations that we need to make informed educational decisions about how the occupation needs to be green. That's the first. The second one is that as the supply and demand metaphor gets us to focus on the end. What are the technical occupations that we need at the end? And what we saw in these studies, a lot of the occupations in the enabling processes were missed in the studies. So the jobs in the procurement, the jobs in marketing, the jobs on the border control, we were missing a lot of that, okay? Because this notion of focusing on supply and demand was actually the second thing that we were not surfacing is, and there's a lot of information that shows us that environmental competencies in workplace is distributed. People don't work on them. So environmental roles are a group of an occupational network. You get people working together, and we're not understanding that. So we're seeing the transitioning of individual jobs, and we're not actually seeing the group of people within a workplace that is impacted by the green transition. The second, I don't know which number I'm at. The third point that we think the metaphor is not helping us to understand is that the focus on the job narrative and the skills for jobs, and most of you will see, a lot of the jobs that are surfacing in the energy transition and in the just transition are technical ones, okay? So the jobs narrative is making us think about jobs, okay? And thinking about the transition as a skills for jobs. Okay, and often the information about it is the technical one. And what misses from there is actually the sustainability narrative. So we're developing more technical professionals, not necessarily ones which have a stronger understanding of sustainability and justice. And the argument is, or the argument we're trying to make is that we need to kind of think about this much more as a continuum. And then the next one is a lot of the information of supply and demand that these studies drew on were employer information. Employers do not understand clearly future skills. So they use their current demand and what their current notions are to make predictions about the future, okay? So we were, in the studies, we were gathering data, okay, from employers and employer surveys, country case studies. The ILO, we developed these country case studies of all 8 of these SADC countries, but they were populated a lot with employer information and employer data. Okay, and of course then, combined with that is the idea that it is very driven by industry, but it's using current conceptions of demand, current value chains, and current jobs to be able to map the future, okay? And I think that this kind of approach to skills and the just transition is showing us very clearly in all of the skills in initiatives that, and I've spent the last 3 months mapping almost every skills initiative linked to just transitioning that's happening in the country, okay? And it's fragmented, it's impossible to get a national picture. You sit with 5 different studies on the hydrogen economy. They're methodologically different, they do not cohere, we are unable to develop a national picture from it. Most of them are done from a point of positional interest, depending who the lead institution is, or which sector is provisioning the study, okay? And that's the type of work that's actually happening related to skills. So we are perpetuating a fragmented landscape, a lot of short courses, a lot of unaccredited training that's emerging. I think I've made the point that just because we create qualifications and training opportunities does not mean occupations will be created in the labor market. And we're not thinking beyond the job. Yeah, and we need a much bigger conceptual idea of what is the skill formation, what are we building? And we need to think about what we're building as beyond the training of individuals. And we need to think about the skill formation system, and that means thinking at multiple levels, multiple intersecting and interconnected questions and sectors, and I've started to kind of map some of them. Thank you very much.
So what you didn't know is the last 2 speakers, when I put up 5 minutes, they took 2 minutes. So they've saved us a lot of time, and we've lost our one discussant. So, you are here. Okay, I was going to say we have Murray speaking for 5 minutes, but we're going to, so I'm not sure which way we should do this. You want to go for, okay. So we're going to give 3 minutes for each discussant, and we'll kick off with Murray. And that was Murray's 3-minute rule, so off you go, Murray. And then we'll open for Q&A afterwards.
So what was the resolution? What's my mandate? Oh, okay. Lovely. Well, thank you. That's unfair of Haroon, by the way, to call it Murray's rule, because we fashioned the session together very carefully with Anda, and hopefully we've done well, because at the start, when we had this work that we wanted to bring to this discussion, until we had Jackie's paper in the mix, we had a bunch of papers about the labor market itself and occupations and skills. And so we were being asked some existential questions by the other partners, like, okay, but like this is a conference on inequality, work and nature. Where's the nature? But we were resolute, because there's a key point here that we've got a very bad habit in this country of diving into a specific issue like the just transition, and then all of a sudden we're talking about Mpumalanga, and we're talking about what sort of labor market adjustments are possible, without the understanding of what's actually going on in our broader labor market and in our broader economy. And it's a discussion about South Africa's transition, in which employment plays a key role. And surely we're called on to balance all of that. And the session was supposed to then provide a useful information into that discussion, but also point out very clearly where our shortfalls are, I think. You can comment as to whether you think we've done okay or not, but the national framing, which I thought you made the great point about, we do these specific studies on skills, et cetera, without understanding the whole national system. And our equivalent, I prefer a less confrontational a partnership between the skills people and the economists. We're all of common cause, and we really do need to understand, because skills sits at the heart of this whole session, right? If you think about what have we done in this session, you know, François gave us a very good profile based on the labor market information, down to using occupational classifications that are in the PALMS data, and then he mapped it onto tasks which don't come from South Africa, but they are very detailed, and that's the best we can do right now in the country. And explained, okay, what is exactly going on? Not going to wages immediately. Let's understand what's going on in the economy with sectors, but down to occupations. And then the issue is really not occupations themselves, it's skills. And so we use tasks. And so very useful framing. And then, but you were asking all these questions about skills, because at the end of the day, our task mapping is our attempt to get to skills, which is the key order. So the questions you were asking about, the existential questions, if you like, about skill measurement, and it's a crucial issue in the country. But at the end of the day, you know, in these policy discussions, one does need to try and work out, try and map onto your point about systemic, about the policy process. Oh, okay. The policy process is crucial, but at the end of the day, we are talking about workers with specific skills that they have right now. And your point was most powerful for me in terms of looking forward, right? You were cautioning us not to just extrapolate off the present, and hopefully you can bring that input into the just transition discussion in a way that can bring information that the economists aren't bringing to the table, or the employers, as you put it. So Jackie then told us how important that is in this discussion about green jobs. And she gave us an example of where we've tried. And it's a logical extension of the work that François presented. And again, so those of us programmers, you've got the skills thing, which is basically a merge, right? Based on good occupational data and classifications. And then Jackie takes it further and there's a whole big literature that Jens was talking about yesterday about also then about the green jobs coming from that side. And there's a whole big international discussion about that. And so the work that we're putting on the table today represents sort of the best we can do right now. But I want to point out, just quickly in closing, and I want to say that there's an extension of that in a project that is being run now using tax data to try and do exactly the same thing, because the tax data then will allow us to embed that spatially across the country. Same chain we're talking about here. But if you can use the tax data effectively, you could essentially get a better mapping of the green jobs. But there's all these sort of key points in that. And so I've already raised the point about, okay, but are we measuring what we need to be measuring? And you raised the point about the skills. And there's a vast literature, and I don't think we've collectively tackled this nearly hard enough in the country, both on the occupations and what level of disaggregation, and the issue that came up in the presentation is we're reducing things to 4-digit occupations. That's not trivial. We're making a huge amount of assumptions. Okay, I'm going to be evicted here. So the occupational data, but also then this mapping onto skills, tasks as we call it. And my final point is that Haroon then brought in, if you use tax data, you leave out the informal sector. So we're building in again the bias against that you raised so wonderfully in your presentation. And my only point about the presentation is that the key link, we have to include the informal sector. It is part of our labor market. We have to understand how it works. But the intersection between the formal and the informal, besides these legislative hassles and all of that sort of stuff, like how does the growth employment elasticity work in other countries between formal and informal? It's crucial knowledge we need to know, because the informal sector have to be included in the just transition. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I am really sorry for coming so late. I just had a big mix-up with times, etc. But from the reading that I did on the papers and the abstracts and some of what I saw in the presentations, I think the main theme that I saw is us to develop a skills strategy and what the strategy actually looks like, and not only looking at the supply and demand, but also trying to understand where, firstly, from an economic standpoint, where the economy is actually going to grow, in what sectors are they going to grow, where in South Africa are these sectors going to grow, where's the investment actually going to go. We need to get down to those levels of detail to understand how to build these ecosystems around it. And I think with Presha's paper specifically, you know, that value chain approach, trying to unpack not just solar PV development or renewable technology development in a specific area, but what does that actually mean in terms of cross-cutting jobs? How do they link up to other technologies in the economy? And all you can see is that there's so many different sectors and so many different minds that need to come together. And I think we're not doing this. We're doing this in isolation. The economists are going in their direction. The just transition people are going in their direction. And also that part is just about the technology, but where is the just element? And then we're talking about reskilling and upskilling. And, you know, I think there was a paper about the non-routine versus routine jobs and automation. I think we're talking about the energy transition, but we also know that sector or that topic is going to filter into a transition of its own, and it's already happening. And we're not planning enough for that. We need to also understand from the bottom who is going to be affected and how they're going to be affected. And I think I saw some indication of, you know, these are all jobs or people that are older in the sector. They probably may have qualifications in some areas, but from a just transition perspective, from a mining perspective, they probably don't have qualifications. And now we're talking about reskilling and upskilling people who've never studied anything in their lives. And I think that's the element of us to try and unpack in terms of what that actually means practically. And how do you unpack it? I think another thing I saw in the papers were this relation to STEM jobs. And going back to the South African education system, I think we really need serious intervention in our education system. We cannot have a pass rate of 30% and expect us to have STEM jobs for this transition, for whatever transition, whether it's the automation transition, for our transition, the energy transition, or all of this included. We will not be able to go forward without STEM jobs. And then we're looking at the inclusion of women and youth in these. How do we incorporate that? And that on its own needs to come up with activities and actions linked to it. And I think this holistic approach can only be done if we all come together. And that's what I think advocating for is let's stop working in silos. Let's all come together and develop a strategy for the common good of the country. And I think that's how we will be able to go forward. Thanks.
Okay, I think we have about 6 minutes for Q&A, but I'm sure we can overflow 2-3 minutes. So could I just ask, I'll maybe take batches of 3-4 questions, but then like we did in the plenary, just introduce yourself and direct it to somebody. So we'll go, okay, I'm trying to spatially distribute it. So if you don't mind, so I'll go 1, 2, I'm trying somebody in the middle, 3. Okay, but keep your hands up. You'll get a chance. There's enough time. No. You.
Thank you, Haroon. And I'm Javier Baez from the World Bank. My question is on your presentation, which I liked it very much, as also the other ones were very good. I think you make a strong case that regulation and registration is creating these high entry barriers. But as you were presenting, I was also reflecting, and perhaps which is the largest informal sector in South Africa is the mini buses, what you call taxis here, which is my understanding in talking to experts is highly regulated. Yet you see it blooming because what happens is that there is a big gap between regulation and enforcement. So I was wondering if you have any views why that gap is not as large in other parts of the informal, in other informal sectors. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, hi, my name is Zenzi, and I have a question also for you, Haroon. I would just like to find out, because you spoke about the constraints of informality, and one of them you said was regulation, and you mentioned that there was regulation that came just before democracy. It was yeah. Now, I want to find out if you managed to, if you considered this, the history of the development of the manufacturing sector in apartheid. Did you consider that? Because I think that maybe that could have also influenced the size of our informal sector, because apartheid itself created a manufacturing sector which is, I want to say, we have a lot of goods which are produced by almost like monopolies, if you understand, like Unilever and all Tiger brands and things like that. So it doesn't leave room, like in other countries where there are larger informal sectors, for people to enter into the market with their goods in the informal sector. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm John Scott from Mexico, from research institution. I also have a question about the informality paper, which was I found fascinating and impossible to believe. Almost not the analysis, but the data coming from Mexico. I think a lot of the restrictions probably apply certainly to many Latin American countries, to Mexico. So I was wondering if there's something else, for example, the concept and the measurement of unemployment, if there's something there which is particular, but mainly the question which obviously arises is how do they survive? No? In Mexico, we have 4% unemployment and more than 50% informality, and the reason is because there's no way somebody which is purely unemployed could survive. So they have to have non-labor market of some kind. And one obvious possibility is transfers, social transfers. So I was wondering if that has something to do. For my presentation later in the afternoon, I looked at some of the numbers of social transfers in South Africa. Cash transfers, they are quite important. No? They are 3 to 5% of GDP. So I was wondering if that plays and secondly, social protection. No? In Latin America, as you may know, a lot of the literature on informality has focused on the costs of formality in terms of social paying taxes and social protection, and the subsidy of non-contributive transfers. No? Thanks.
Okay. I promise you I didn't know that all questions were for me. I'll do them very quickly, but then hopefully the next round I'll exclude questions for me so that the other presenters, just in case. So Javier, I think minibus taxis is almost, so firstly they're formal, right? So they're highly regulated. They have, debt funding. Those guys are bankrupt, and there are all sorts of issues going on there. And then they are, I don't know enough about, I think people at UCT have done some work on it, but they almost operate as a syndicate, right? They protect routes and they divvy it up. So they're all, I mean, maybe they're oligopolies of sorts. So in many ways, they're part of the challenge, actually, of deregulating. So I would argue they're a little bit, it's a little bit of a case of informalizing the transport sector. So the point I always make is you can find a minibus taxi that's highly regulated, prices are set and so on, and then you can take an Uber, and there's nothing in between, right? If you think of other countries like rickshawalas in India and so on. So I think that's a really important discussion, but in a way that's not about the informal sector, but actually almost about deregulating and increasing informality or opportunities for non-taxi operators, right? But we can talk a little bit, because the associations run those transport routes and so on, and there's a lot of violence as a barrier to entry, right? If you try and take alternative routes. Zinzi, we can pick it up later, but I think the point, it's product market structure actually rather acts as a barrier to entry, which we didn't discuss. So the idea in South Africa that you've got highly concentrated economies that may partly explain the Mexico comparison. So we've got highly concentrated sectors. So in manufacturing, for example, 70% of all manufacturing subsectors have 5 operators or less, right, in a particular subsector. That then acts as a natural barrier to entry, right? So if you think of retail, there are four big retailers in the country. It's really difficult if you're operating in cities where you have these additional regulations, and then you've got large listed operators, retailers. Very difficult for the informal sector to find oxygen, as it were. But linking, I think, so this is the sort of, I call it the Ricardo Hausmann journey, because what happens is they come into the country and say, data's the problem, right? So that would be great, right? If data's a problem, then we've got lots of other question marks about all the work we've done in terms of measuring unemployment and so on. I think we're okay with the data. There may be a little bit about how people conceive of whether they have a job or not, but I think we're okay there. And essentially, I think it's social transfers. So entry into the household of incomes from government through social grants and work Murray and I did years ago on the distribution of the unemployed across households. Shows a lot of support even pre the extension of social grants. Pre that period, you see the unemployed attaching themselves, as we put it, to employed households. So I think there's a lot of that happens as well. But I think it's a really useful point to keep at it, because it is the discipline you need, which is, well, how does that distribution look for Mexico, right? Are the unemployed not attaching themselves to the employed, and so on? Okay, I think there was 1, 2, and then Josh 3 and 4, and then we'll stop, I think. Okay. Yeah, we can hear you, hey? But I think maybe for online.
Thanks. And I think we agree very much that, as Anthony Giver from the National Business Initiative, I think there's strong agreement that the informal sector is a key area of concern when we're talking about employment growth and skills development as well, because we don't have enough workplaces even that can train young people besides employing them. So the challenge around how we bring more informal businesses into the mainstream of the economy and get them to be, particularly in terms of the just energy transition, if we're going to achieve it. So thinking about it in terms of, we know that in the just energy transition, well, in the energy transition, a lot of the opportunities that are going to be created are in the technical space, right? And we know that if you look at the artisanal sector, the large majority of people operating in various artisanal industries are operating in the informal economy and are underqualified or unqualified, so they don't have any formal training, and they're not employing, as we know, as we've seen. So the question is how we talk about regulation, and that's a critical area of it, but there's also an issue around market access and how we're going to get more of these artisanal businesses in the technical fields to be able to access opportunities in the economy, right? To be able to grow. And you talk particularly about if you've got artisanal entrepreneurs in townships who want to be able to grow and create jobs, how are they going to access these industries? How are they going to access these value chains that are emerging? How are we going to break through some of the barriers? Because all we're doing as we're creating this energy market is we're just perpetuating the same market characteristics that we've had forever, right? Where your large majority of informal businesses are locked out of opportunities. So if there's solar PV installations happening, who are they calling to do those solar PV installations and the like? And that's a function, one, of market barrier, access to market barriers, but it's also a function of skilling, and it's a function of the regulation and all of these barriers that these SMEs face. And calling them SMEs, informal SMEs face when these markets are created. So somehow in your understanding of how we're going to unlock jobs and how we're going to create demand for skills, right, we have to understand how we're going to get many of these operators in townships who have the potential to create these jobs to be able to access these markets, and what are the factors that we're going to have to address in that, and on the demand side, but also on the supply side.
Okay, I'm going to leave that for Presha to answer.
All right, thanks a lot. So my question was actually to you, so you can exclude it. You don't need to comment on it. But my name is Jens. I'm from the International Labour Organization, and I just want to reflect. I think it's absolutely fascinating that the informal sector in South Africa is too formal, actually, because many of the things you mentioned up there in terms of barriers to entry and regulations and registration, actually what describes the formal economy or formal sector in many other countries. So I think the question you need to ask yourself as a country, would you rather have high levels of informality with informal economic activities and informal conditions of employment, or would you rather have high levels of unemployment that put other types of pressures on the system? So I don't know. I know you academics don't like to make policy recommendations, but what are you coming up with? What needs to be done to do this so actually more people can enter into the informal economy, which clearly is a buffer. It is a buffer for many people, or in countries where the formal labor market does not, where the labor market doesn't create enough formal employment opportunities. Who's the next one?
It was Josh and then the lady at the back. Josh.
Thanks. So a question for François. Firstly, yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. One of the things that struck me is that it seemed like a lot of the decline was coming from routine manual rather than routine cognitive. And I was wondering how, if that is the case, how one distinguishes between a task-based story of sectoral change versus one that's based on like industry rise and fall. I mean, because and it did seem to mainly be in the primary and secondary sectors that that like big decline was happening. And I understand it's happening across industries, but it would be interesting to look, I don't know, a little bit if it's about like a sectoral reallocation on the industry side rather than the occupation side. I don't exactly know how one does that. And that just broadly is about the question of whether the framework in the US is applicable here. I mean, like whether those summary stats are interpretable in multiple different ways. I mean, one of the things that I think about is there's this Owen Crankshaw, this like sociologist, and did all this stuff on the apartheid skill structure and task structure, which was very much built around trying to get around the color bar and how inefficient that was for businesses. And it often makes me think like, is that legacy still there? Do we still have like a lot of routine manual jobs because they would businesses were trying to be able to employ black workers when they weren't allowed to employ black workers if they were in skilled jobs? And is it the change in that which partly explains the story that as the color bar erodes, you have a changing in occupational structure?
Great question. The last one.
Hello, so I'm Takwana, and I'm coming from an organization called Oribi. We're an impact incubator, and we believe kind of in social entrepreneurship as a pathway to many of these transitions we're talking about. I think maybe there's a reflection for Jackie or our chairman. I'm interested to find out kind of when we look at the informal economy, because there's value chains that are invisible that exist there, and there's tasks that are existing there, and to what extent are those green? And what would be the implications then when we're thinking about green policy, and I think answering to the National Business Initiative's question. The second one is to Presha. I just wanted to find out, you included there that there's a high level of unaccredited trainings. I just wanted to find out kind of like your thinking about including it there and the relevance, mainly because being in the sector that is part of bringing these high unaccredited trainings, is being part of skills formation and finding that TVETs, universities are quite static and they're not answering to the evolving needs of the economy. So I just wanted to understand that a little bit more.
Okay, so thanks very much. We're going to ask Presha, Jacqueline, and François in that order. Is that fine? To answer the questions that were posed to you. Let's take them.
Okay. So when I was talking about unaccredited training, I was not only talking about university-based qualifications. I was talking about a lot of, there's a lot of training at the moment that is happening that is short-term responsive, that is being conducted by, I don't want to say private provider because but you know, you know, Anthony, you get money, you get Anthony to train your SMMEs in a particular area. And there's a lot of evidence of that happening at the moment. Now, the issue with that type of training is that the young people that come out of their training, what the literature shows us is that short course training actually helps people that already have some kind of disciplinary knowledge. It's easier for you to learn in a short course, okay, if you've maybe got some kind of education background. So the theory of just taking unemployed youth and putting them through 1 week short course, in a long-term perspective, the educational literature has shown in many parts of the world, it doesn't help their learning pathways. And that's the issue, is unaccredited training. If the market doesn't understand the training that they've had, you're not actually helping them to build a pathway. You know, and that's the issue, coming back to the kind of, what kind of skill formation system are we trying to build? Okay, and I'm going to take Anthony's question as a comment.
Thanks. Please repeat the question for me. Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the informal sectors or entrepreneurs is that we don't have information on these tasks, but I know there are processes in trying to collect this information on what exactly are young people in entrepreneurship doing. And from that information, I think we can be able to at least, you know, count or profile the share of green jobs that these people are doing. Does that answer your question? I will keep reflecting on it.
Thanks, Josh. I had a feeling that all the questions were going to be on the informal sector. It was a nice topic. So just in terms of routine, yeah, so the first point is that those are not absolute declines. So employment's grown across all three of those. It's just the rate of growth is faster for. So those non-routine occupations, they're relatively small compared to the routine manual and the routine cognitive. But in terms of relative numbers, so the shares, the routine manuals declined over time. And I think I was just looking at the top few occupations within routine manual, just in terms of their shares within that subcategory. Farm hands and laborers, hand packers and manufacturing laborers. So those are both it's agriculture, manufacturing, helpers and cleaners in offices, hotels and other establishments. So that's a bit of a service one. Building construction laborers, okay, it's construction. Motor vehicle mechanics and fitters, agricultural, industrial machinery mechanics, machine tool operators. Most of it's going to be, and then there's a couple of mining. So it's mining and manufacturing. So, I mean, I think the structural transformation story is there in terms of declining. And when I looked at just the absolute levels with mining, that's the only one that's really declined in absolute numbers. So a lot of mining jobs have been lost over that period. Manufacturing, as we know, is flat. So I think there's a structural transformation story there, certainly with the primary and secondary sectors. Yeah. And then the second part of your question, we can talk about. Yeah.
Okay. Can you give the presenters another round of applause and the discussions? Thank you.